He thought his grandma just crocheted for fun, until he visited a children's hospital and saw a room decorated with the same stitches and a plaque with the name of a child he never knew had changed his grandma's life forever. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell. It helps us share even more heartfelt stories like this one. And tell us, where are you watching from? Which city or country do you call home? Thank you so much for being here. Caleb never questioned the quiet hum of his grandmother's hands weaving through yarn each night. But one rainy afternoon, a forgotten hospital wing, a plaque and a familiar stitch would unravel the truth behind those silent hours and reveal the promise that shaped both of their destinies forever. Caleb was 10 when he first noticed the light under the kitchen door late at night. It was always the same warm glow, flickering just enough to cast shadows on the worn rug by the hallway. Their small house in the outskirts of Bristol, England, creaked under the weight of old wood and older memories. He would tiptoe across the floor, careful not to make a sound. Through a narrow gap in the door, he saw the silhouette of his grandmother, Evelyn, hunched over the kitchen table. Her fingers, gnarled by years of work, moved delicately. He didn't know exactly what she was doing, only that it involved colorful yarn and a crochet hook that seemed to glint in the lamplight. Every night, she seemed more focused than ever, whispering words he couldn't make out. There was something mesmerizing about her silent dedication. By day, Evelyn was gentle, always wearing a reserved smile and a faded apron. At mealtimes, she'd serve Caleb modest portions of stew or soup and quietly brush off his questions about her past. He knew his mother had passed away when he was 3. Beyond that, details were sparse. "Don't worry your head," Evelyn would say whenever he asked how she managed the bills or why she chose to live in such a small, cramped home. "I've got my obligations," she would add, almost in a whisper. That night, as the drizzle outside pattered against the window, Caleb pressed his ear closer to the door. He could hear the steady scratch of metal against yarn, an almost hypnotic rhythm. Summoning courage, he gave the door a gentle push. Evelyn looked up, eyes wide. The lamp's light carved deep lines into her face, revealing an undercurrent of sadness. Before he could speak, she stood and quietly blocked the doorway. "Time for bed, my boy," she said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "These old bones need to keep busy, but you need your sleep." Caleb felt a pang of curiosity, but something about her expression stopped him from asking further. He thought for a moment she looked almost frightened, of what he couldn't imagine. She guided him back to bed, tucking him in as she always did, with a precise fold of blankets around his shoulders. The smell of lavender soap and the warmth of her care made his eyelids heavy. "Grandma," he murmured sleepily, "why do you stay up so late?" She paused, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I have my reasons, dear. You'll understand when the time is right." Within minutes, he drifted off, lulled by the soft hush of rain and the lingering memory of her frail hands working in the lamplight. But questions buzzed in his mind. What could be so important that she lost sleep over it? And why did it seem like a burden she couldn't share? Over the following weeks, he tried to sneak another look or two, but each time she sent him back to bed. Sometimes he glimpsed the flashes of bright yarn, red, blue, yellow, woven into patterns. Other times, she'd be tidying something away, as if she didn't want him to see. During the day, the house wore the same calm as always. Stacks of old newspapers lay on the dining table, the radio softly playing classical music on the windowsill. If he asked about the night's activities, she would simply say, "A promise is a promise, my boy," and give him that mysterious half-smile. He noticed a certain look in her eyes whenever he pressed too hard, a mixture of sorrow and unspoken longing. It was as if she carried a weight he wasn't yet old enough to help lift, Their life was modest. They seldom traveled beyond the local market or the church bazaar. Yet, sometimes when they passed the city hospital on the bus, Evelyn would stare out the window, her lips drawn tight. Caleb sensed a story there, something older than he was, stretching back to a time and place he knew nothing about. Late at night, he tried to imagine what she might be doing, crocheting so intently. Was she making things for sale to pay the bills, or was it simply a way to pass the lonely hours? One morning, he ventured a guess. "Grandma, do you crochet for money?" She looked at him with a soft sadness, gently shaking her head. "No, Caleb, not for money." She didn't elaborate. Late that evening, a gust of cold wind shook the window panes and he awoke to see the kitchen door ajar. The lamp was still on, but Evelyn's chair was empty. Curious, he crept inside and glimpsed a half-finished piece of crochet lying on the table. It was a small blanket with neat, intricate stitches. Before he could take a closer look, her footsteps sounded in the hallway. His heart pounded. He darted back to his room, diving under the covers just as she approached. He heard her sigh before she turned off the kitchen light. As he drifted back into sleep, he could still see that half-formed blanket in his mind's eye. Threads of every color, woven together with painstaking care, and though he didn't know it yet, each loop carried a secret from Evelyn's past. In that quiet hour before dawn, the house remained as it always was, simple on the outside, yet brimming with unspoken stories that lay just beyond the flickering yellow glow. He could never have guessed how those threads would bind them both to a promise that started decades ago, or how that promise would someday reshape his entire understanding of love, family, and sacrifice. It was early morning when Caleb reluctantly pulled on the homemade red crochet jacket. He grimaced at the slightly uneven sleeves and the odd pattern across the back. Evelyn stood by the kitchen doorway, her posture rigid, watching him. For a fleeting moment, he almost saw relief in her eyes, as though she were glad he was wearing something she made. Yet he was too wrapped up in his own world to notice. "Don't let them get to you," she said softly. He only half listened, giving a non-committal shrug. He grabbed his school bag and headed out into the chilly street, where small rows of terraced houses lined the block. An overcast sky promised rain. At school, the teasing began almost immediately. "Grandma's boy," a tall, freckled classmate jeered, tugging on the sleeve of the bright red jacket. Another mimicked crocheting motions in the air, making the others roar with laughter. Caleb's face burned, and he felt a wave of humiliation he had never before experienced. He muttered under his breath, trying to contain his anger. He spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact, slumping in his seat, tugging nervously at the jacket. By the time the final bell rang, he was so tense that his head ached. On the walk home, thin drops of rain began to fall, each one feeling like a pinprick against his skin. Or maybe it was just the shame sinking into him. Evelyn greeted him at the door with a careful smile. "How was your day, dear?" He set his bag down without a word. She saw the expression on his face. "Something happened," she said, more statement than question. "They laughed at me," he said coldly, "because of this." He gestured at the crocheted sleeves. "Why can't we buy normal clothes like everyone else?" Her face stiffened, and her eyes flicked to the jacket. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I just wanted to keep you warm." "I don't need your crocheted stuff," he snapped, voice cracking. He yanked the jacket off, tossing it onto the nearest chair. "I don't want to wear it anymore." Evelyn stood there, hands twisting nervously. The lines in her forehead grew deeper. For a moment, she opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. The tension lingered in the house that evening. Caleb locked himself in his tiny bedroom, flipping through a textbook aimlessly. but all he could think about was his grandmother's upset face. Guilt tugged at him, but he was too embarrassed to apologize. Later that night, he heard her rummaging in the kitchen cupboards. When he passed by the doorway, she was checking a near-empty jar of sugar and a single can of soup. She gave him a hurried, forced smile. "I'm just making sure we have enough for tomorrow," she said. He turned away, not noticing the anxiety in her eyes. He also didn't notice that the crocheted jacket he had tossed aside was now folded neatly on the back of the sofa. As hours passed, the gentle sounds of the city quieted, but the subdued hush of their home felt louder than any daytime clamor. Caleb lay awake, flicking through half-finished homework. Eventually, a faint aroma of something cooking in the kitchen drifted toward his room. His stomach growled. He crept down the hallway. Peeking around the corner, he saw his grandmother stirring a thin porridge. Next to the pot, she'd placed a small bottle of medicine. She took a careful sip of the food, wincing in disappointment. Then, with a deep sigh, she ladled half of it into an old mug. Her gaze wandered to the crocheted jacket resting on the chair, and her expression became distant. "I wish I could do more," she whispered to herself, unaware Caleb was watching. "But at least he's got the medicine." Caleb stepped back, heart thudding. Medicine? He recalled the day the school nurse had given him a few pills for a mild infection. But had they really come from the school? Confusion tightened his chest. Was his grandmother paying for them out of her own scant resources? Later, in his room, he tried to sleep. Scenes reeled through his mind. The mocking classmates, his grandmother's pained look, that meager pot of porridge. He couldn't piece it all together. What exactly was she sacrificing for him? He felt a sting in his chest that he hadn't recognized before. Part shame, part worry. Why didn't she just tell him the truth? In the morning, he found the crocheted jacket neatly folded on his desk. A simple note, scrawled in her shaky handwriting, lay on top. "Caleb, I won't insist you wear it. Please just remember I love you." He stood there, note in hand, feeling a sudden weight of remorse, but pride kept him from rushing to her side. Instead, he placed the jacket in his drawer, uncertain if he'd ever wear it again. Unbeknownst to him, that small act of rejection would tug at a thread in their bond, one that was far more delicate than the crocheted loops on any piece of yarn. 6 years slid by like leaves carried away by a gentle current. Caleb turned 16 amid quiet birthdays and evenings spent avoiding awkward conversation. He attended a secondary school closer to central Bristol, which broadened his world, but drove a wedge deeper between him and Evelyn. He now saw more of the city's bustle, more of his peers' modern clothes and easy spending habits. Each day, he became increasingly aware that his grandmother's frugal ways and homemade items set him apart. One overcast afternoon, he received terrible news. His friend Liam had been in an accident. Caleb rushed to the hospital, a sprawling beige building near the center of town. A labyrinth of corridors greeted him as he searched for the pediatric ward. He carried a small stuffed animal for Liam, feeling a pang of guilt. Evelyn had crocheted it years ago, yet he'd never given it to anyone until now. After several wrong turns, he found Ward C, only to learn that Liam was undergoing tests. "Have a seat in the waiting area," a passing nurse said. Caleb wandered the hallway, but found no seats that weren't already occupied. Spotting a sign for quiet rooms, he followed the arrows down a corridor that got dimmer with each step. At the end, he saw a wooden door slightly ajar. Inside was a small lounge, seemingly unused. Dimly lit by a single overhead light, it was furnished with worn couches, and the walls were draped in colorful crochet. Something about those patterns made his stomach twist. Stepping in, he squinted at the embroidered shapes. Each piece was carefully sewn onto large panels. A hush enveloped him, as though he'd stumbled on a secret. His eyes landed on a faded plaque above one of the couches. Emily's room, decorated with love by Evelyn M., in memory of a promise. He froze. Evelyn M. There was no mistaking it. That had to mean Evelyn, his grandmother. A wave of confusion and disbelief swept over him. Why would she decorate a hospital room? And who was Emily? He inched closer to a crocheted blanket spread over a nearby armchair. The corner bore a familiar signature, a tiny C embroidered in the same style that used to appear on his crocheted hats as a child. He felt a jolt, recognizing the color combination. It was identical to one of his old blankets from years ago, soft blues and grays. But there, discreetly woven in red thread, was his own name, Caleb. How could this be here? He reached out, brushing his fingertips across the yarn. It felt like a violation of sorts, like peering into someone's diary. Part of him wanted to turn and flee, but curiosity tugged him further in. There were photos pinned on a corkboard. Children in hospital gowns, wrapped in blankets, crocheted hats on their small heads. In each photo, the crocheted work bore the same style he knew so well. He tried to make sense of it. Had his grandmother donated them? But why had she never said anything? And who was Emily? The name left a bitter taste on his tongue, as though it was connected to a chapter of Evelyn's life he'd never glimpsed. Leaning in to examine the plaque more closely, he noticed an inscription at the bottom, for every child who felt alone in their darkest hour. The words made his skin prickle. Alone. Darkest hour. Wasn't that how his grandmother must have felt all those nights she spent crocheting? Suddenly, a nurse appeared in the doorway, startling him. "Oh, sorry," she said. "I didn't realize anyone still came in here. This room hasn't been used for a while." Caleb cleared his throat. Who decorated it?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. The nurse gave a tentative smile. "A woman named Evelyn, many years ago. She stopped by often, always crocheting new things. This used to be a comfort room for children in recovery, but after budgets were cut and renovations were made, we stopped using it. We keep it open for the occasional visitor, but honestly, few people even know it's here." He swallowed, pulse hammering. "When was the last time she came?" The nurse shook her head. "Hard to say. I've been here 10 years, and she never showed up in my time, though I've heard stories. She was devoted." "Did anyone mention an Emily?" His voice wavered around the unfamiliar name. A confused expression flickered across her features. "Emily? I'm not sure. Maybe check old records in the volunteer office if you need more info. I wish I could help." She nodded politely and left. Standing alone in that silent room, a flood of questions rushed through his mind. Why hadn't Evelyn ever mentioned this to him? What promise had she made to a child named Emily? And why was his name woven into a blanket in a hospital lounge that time seemed to have forgotten? He left the room with shaky legs and hurried back to the main ward, feeling as if he'd discovered a hidden part of his grandmother's life that made no sense. Liam's accident had brought him here, but it seemed fate had steered him toward a bigger mystery. He sensed that everything he thought he knew about Evelyn was about to unravel, like a loose thread on one of her beloved blankets. Caleb returned home from the hospital that evening, trembling with restless thoughts. The moment he walked through the front door, he spotted Evelyn in the kitchen, washing dishes with a distant expression. She was humming a soft tune, the notes trembling in the stuffy air. He dropped his backpack on a chair. "Grandma," he began, voice unsteady, "I went to see Liam at the hospital, but I found a room." He paused, noticing her shoulders tense. "It's called Emily's room." Her back remained to him, hands still submerged in soapy water. The only sign that she'd heard was the slight trembling in her shoulders. After a long silence, she slowly dried her hands and turned around. Her eyes held both a deep sadness and a hint of trepidation. "What were you doing in that part of the hospital?" she asked quietly, her voice unusually tight. "I got lost," he said, swallowing hard. "I saw crocheted blankets with my name on them and a plaque mentioning you. Grandma, what is all of that? Why didn't you ever tell me you donated things there?" Evelyn walked to the dining table, pulling out a chair. She sank into it, suddenly looking far older than her 60-something years. Her gaze hovered over an invisible spot. "Because some promises belong in the dark," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're not secrets exactly, but they hurt to talk about." He approached cautiously. "Is Emily someone you knew?" Her lips tightened and she looked away. "That's a story I'm not sure you're ready to hear." Frustration flared in him. "I'm 16. I'm not a child. I have the right to know. You've been crocheting these things for years, staying up all night. Why hide that? And why is my name stitched there?" She offered only a tired glance. "It's complicated, Caleb." Then she stood, turning her back on him as if to end the conversation. Fury rose in his chest. He lashed out, "No! You don't get to say it's complicated and walk away. I found a memorial that you created for some child named Emily. There were pictures, letters, crocheted toys. Everything was yours. And I've been in the dark this whole time." She froze, the seconds stretched, thick with tension. At last she exhaled. "Fine," she said, shoulders sagging. "I made a promise long ago. It was a promise to a girl who needed warmth more than anything else in the world, and that's all you need to know right now." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, betraying the weight she carried. Without waiting for his response, she left the room. The hollow echo of her footsteps on the stairs echoed in his head. He stood there, rage and confusion swirling. He didn't even know where to begin. He wanted to demand answers, but something in her face warned him it might cause more harm than good. Nights passed, and the house felt colder despite the mild weather. Tension replaced the usual gentle calm. Caleb refused to let this go. He decided to investigate on his own. While Evelyn went out for groceries one morning, he rummaged through the cluttered attic he'd avoided for years. After rummaging through boxes of dusty photo albums, old receipts and letters, he unearthed a small wooden chest, locked with a flimsy clasp. He pried it open, revealing bundles of yarn in muted colors, a few crocheted squares, and wrapped in a piece of cloth, a small crocheted doll with an embroidered E on the chest. Alongside the doll lay hospital payment slips dated decades ago. Intrigued, he held the doll up. Its yarn was slightly frayed, as if it had been handled many times. Who had held it, and why? Beneath the slips, he found a torn letter. Part of the writing was missing, but he could make out a sentence. She only ever asked for one thing, a hug, nothing more. The words set his heart pounding. Was this about Emily? Was she alone in that hospital, with no one but Evelyn to care for her? A noise startled him. He quickly replaced the items and shut the chest, covering it with a dusty blanket. Racing downstairs, he nearly collided with Evelyn, who stood by the front door carrying groceries. She eyed him suspiciously. "Were you in the attic?" Caleb forced a casual shrug. "Just looking for an old jacket," he lied, his pulse racing. For a moment she looked as though she might scold him, but then her expression softened into worry. "Some things up there are better left alone," she said quietly, and she hurried to the kitchen. Late that night, he lay in bed, turning the puzzle pieces over in his mind. A girl named Emily, hospital bills from decades ago, crocheted dolls, and a single request for a hug. Whatever truth Evelyn was hiding, it seemed like it was bound to heartbreak. Still, he couldn't tear his thoughts away. Why would his grandmother shield him from it? And why did that child's memory haunt her so deeply that she continued crocheting for other children? Caleb felt a surge of determination. If Evelyn wouldn't tell him, he'd find out for himself. Even if it meant prying into the past and uncovering a wound that clearly hadn't healed, he had to know the story behind Emily's room. Something told him that the promise Evelyn had made long ago was about more than just comforting a dying child. It was about guilt, regret, or maybe even redemption. And if he had any hope of mending the growing distance between them, he needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. His resolve to investigate spurred him back to the hospital on a grey Saturday morning. He felt awkward walking through the corridors alone, not here to visit anyone. It occurred to him to lie and say he was searching for volunteer information. Approaching the front desk, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to a middle-aged receptionist. "I'm hoping to find some old records. My grandmother, Evelyn M., used to volunteer crocheted blankets for the children's ward. And there's someone named Emily." The receptionist arched an eyebrow. "Volunteers come and go. For records that old, you'd have to check the volunteer office or archives. Are you sure you want to dig that far back?" He nodded firmly. "Yes, it's important." "Read." After a short walk and a few misguided directions, he found the dusty volunteer office in a less traveled wing of the hospital. Stacks of paper threatened to tumble off every available surface. An older nurse with kind eyes greeted him, introducing herself as Nurse Pemberton. When he mentioned Evelyn M., her face lit up with a flicker of recognition, then dimmed. She was quite the legend here, though many new staff don't know her, Nurse Pemberton said, pulling open a file drawer. She crocheted for kids who had no visitors or were in palliative care. A silent angel, if you ask me. But Emily, let's see. She rifled through manila folders until she found one so old the edges had yellowed. "Emily Rowan," she said, scanning the pages. "Died in the 1970s. She was barely 6 years old, no next of kin listed. This is unusual. Not many details remain. Just a note that a volunteer, your grandmother presumably, visited her daily." Caleb's heart sank. Why was Emily alone? Pemberton sighed, shaking her head. Sometimes parents or guardians vanish. Maybe they couldn't afford her treatment or they just left. The system has holes. She frowned at the file. "It says here that Emily's mother was untraceable. Your grandmother took it upon herself to watch over her. I believe that's when she made the biggest promise of her life." She pointed to a scribbled note at the bottom of a page. "No child should face the cold alone." He let out a long, shaky breath. "So that's why my grandmother crocheted all those blankets." Pemberton nodded. "I heard rumors that she always felt some personal sorrow tied to that little girl. A sorrow that went beyond just pity. But that was never written down." She shut the file. "Is your grandmother still around? I'd love to say hello." Caleb paused, struggling to find the right words. She is, but she doesn't really talk about those days. I think it hurts too much." Pemberton gave him a sympathetic smile. "Be patient with her. Whatever happened, it left a mark." Feeling a lump in his throat, he thanked her and left. He wandered down the corridor until he found a small hospital cafe. Settling at a corner table, he sipped a hot chocolate, mind racing. Emily Rowan, a forgotten child from the 1970s. Evelyn's vow to keep children warm. But what had caused his grandmother to become so devoted? Was it pure compassion or something else? His phone buzzed. Liam, now recovering, had sent a text. "How are you doing, mate? You disappeared earlier." Caleb typed a quick reply explaining he was doing some research about his grandmother's past. It sounded bizarre even to him, but it was the truth. He stared at the screen, waiting for Liam's response, but none came immediately. Finishing his drink, he decided to return to the deserted lounge known as Emily's room. The crocheted blankets and photos felt like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle he was determined to solve. Entering the dim space, he found it unchanged. The dusty hush enveloped him. He traced the patterns on the walls until he recognized a small crocheted heart with a signature in memory of ER. He imagined a frail little girl lying in a hospital bed, frightened by the beep of machines and the fluorescent lights overhead. And there was Evelyn, younger, perhaps more energetic, sitting by her side day after day. It made him ache to think about a child with no family. A wave of guilt crashed over him as he remembered how impatient he had been with his grandmother. He had taken her for granted, even belittled her crocheting. Maybe it was a gift born of heartbreak, offered not just to keep him warm, but to keep her own memories alive. Memories of Emily. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, half expecting a nurse. But nobody was there. Must have been his imagination. Still, an unsettling thought took root in his mind. Had Evelyn lost someone dear to her, just as he'd lost his mother? Could Emily be some reflection of what she felt for her own child, or her longing for a family that was ripped away? Stepping back from the crocheted displays, he resolved to confront Evelyn again. This time, he wouldn't shout, nor would he let her brush him aside. He owed it to both Emily and Evelyn to find out the truth. If there was a secret fueling this quiet devotion, he needed to understand it, even if it meant tearing open old wounds. Yet a nagging fear gnawed at him. What if the truth was more painful than he could handle? As he left Emily's room, a single crocheted blanket caught his eye. Its pattern was incomplete, a series of stitches that ended abruptly as though the maker had run out of time. The sight made his heart clench. It was the perfect reflection of Emily's own short life, and perhaps a prophecy of what was still to come. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the threadbare curtains of their living room. Caleb found Evelyn at the small dining table, carefully sorting through an array of colored yarn balls. Her eyes darted up at him, and for a moment, neither spoke. "I know about Emily," Caleb began, voice quivering with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Why couldn't you just tell me, Grandma?" She pressed her lips together and smoothed a fold in her apron. "Knowing about Emily won't change what happened. Sometimes it's better not to drag the past into the present." He felt frustration simmer within him. It already is in the present. You spend your nights crocheting for kids in hospitals. That's not just the past. And all this time I've been... He paused, recalling the humiliations at school, his own resentment for wearing homemade clothes. "I just wish you trusted me enough to explain." She met his gaze, tears shining in her eyes. "It was never about trust. It's about not burdening you with a pain I chose to carry." His chest tightened. "But it's affecting me anyway. I found that room, your plaque, pictures of sick children wrapped in your blankets, my name embroidered on a chair. How could you do all of that and keep me in the dark?" There was a silence before she spoke, and he realized just how frail she seemed. "That room was never meant for you to see. The crocheted pieces you found with your name, that was me hoping you'd never forget where you came from." Caleb's voice rose. "Forget what? A life of poverty, being teased because I wear crocheted clothes? You think I asked for that?" Evelyn flinched as though struck. "No, Caleb, I only wanted you to feel safe, to have warmth I couldn't give another child long ago. A child who died cold and alone." That image smacked him like a blow. He pictured Emily, tiny and frightened, but the anger was too raw, too tangled. "Stop treating me like some replacement for her," he shouted. "I'm not your second chance at being a mother." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, and for a split second he thought she might collapse. But a stubborn set of her jaw appeared. "You have no idea how much I've sacrificed," she said, voice shaking. "How many nights I stayed awake to keep you fed, to keep a roof over your head. You have no idea the guilt and regret I've lived with." He clenched his fists. "Maybe I don't, because you won't talk to me. You just hide behind your yarn and needles, crocheting as if that fixes everything." The moment the words escaped his lips, he regretted them. But it was too late. Evelyn trembled, turning away to hide her tears. "If that's how you feel," she whispered, "then maybe I should stop." "Fine," he spat. "Do whatever you want. It's not like I need your crocheted blankets or your secrets." As soon as he uttered the words, an icy wave of regret washed over him. Her back remained rigid, though he could sense her shoulders trembling. Without another word, she left the room. A suffocating silence settled over the house. Hours later, Caleb paced his bedroom floor, replaying the fight in his mind. Her haunting expression and the hint of betrayal in her eyes wouldn't leave him. Part of him wanted to apologize, but resentment still coiled inside him. Days passed, marked by tense breakfasts and dinners eaten in near silence. Evelyn hardly crocheted, merely folding laundry or scrubbing dishes with anxious precision. She coughed more often, yet refused to see a doctor, insisting they had more pressing expenses. One drizzly evening, he returned home to find her leaning heavily against the kitchen counter, short of breath. He rushed to help, but she waved him away. "I'm fine," she insisted, forcing a weak smile. "The last thing you want is me coddling you, right?" Her words stung. He shuffled uncomfortably. "Grandma, please." "It's all right," she said softly. "I'll be in my room." She walked off, leaving him standing there, staring at the lonely crochet hook resting on the table, thread dangling from it like a broken promise. That night, sleep was elusive. He thought of how she'd quietly sold a crocheted vest to buy his medication when he was younger. The humiliations he'd endured at school now felt trivial compared to her silent sacrifices. He realized with a pang that every crocheted item she made was an act of love, for him and for children like Emily. Yet he'd thrown it in her face, telling her he didn't need her. Tossing and turning, he recalled the hospital room, the crocheted blanket, the plaque bearing his grandmother's name, the memory of a child who died alone. And he pictured Evelyn, forging a bond he had never understood, pouring every ounce of warmth she could muster into each stitch. Morning came, bringing no relief from the guilt that gnawed at him. He decided he had to find out more, not just for his own curiosity, but to truly grasp the weight of his grandmother's pain. Maybe if he unraveled the secrets behind Emily, he could discover how to heal the rift between them before it was too late. A quiet tension reigned in the house. Days turned into a week without crocheting. Evelyn left her yarn untouched in a corner, as though she no longer had the strength or desire to continue. Whenever Caleb tried to approach, she seemed haunted by exhaustion. Each time he opened his mouth to speak, guilt formed a lump in his throat. One afternoon, while Evelyn visited a neighbor's yard sale, he ventured into her bedroom for the first time in years. It smelled of lavender and old linens. A single crocheted blanket lay folded at the foot of her bed, the only sign of her former passion. He hesitated, then stepped inside. Atop a small dresser lay a worn notebook. Its spine was cracked, and the edges of its pages were frayed. Curiosity burning, he lifted the cover. On the first page, in Evelyn's tidy handwriting, was a list of names, each followed by brief notes. Marissa T., newborn with pneumonia. Jonathan W., surgery for bone tumor. Grace P., orphan with burns. The list continued for pages, each child a reminder of vulnerability and need. Further down, he found more recent entries. Sammy R., heart defect. Annika S., severe asthma. At last, on the final page, he spotted a name written in shimmering gold ink. For the one I'll never see. There was no mention of a hospital or a diagnosis, just that cryptic line. As he flipped back through the pages, he noticed certain names were crossed out with a small heart drawn next to them, as though Evelyn learned those children had recovered or been released. Others had no heart, only a faint line through them. He guessed that meant they hadn't survived. A wave of awe and sadness overtook him. The magnitude of his grandmother's compassion staggered him. So many children, each receiving crocheted items from an anonymous old woman who refused to let them go cold. She had poured heartache and care into every single loop, and he had told her he didn't need her. Movement by the window caught his eye. A neighbor's cat darted across the yard, but as he turned, he saw something else. A small, half-open drawer beneath the dresser. Inside it, he found a piece of golden thread, the same color used to write, "For the one I'll never see." He held it up in the light, feeling an inexplicable sense of longing. Returning to the hallway, he heard the front door open downstairs. Panicking, he shoved the notebook and thread back into the drawer, carefully sliding it shut. Evelyn's footsteps creaked on the stairs. He slipped out of her room, shutting the door behind him, heart pounding. She caught sight of him in the corridor, and her gaze darted to her bedroom door. "Were you in my room?" Her voice was stern but laced with worry. He tried to hold her gaze. "I needed answers," he said softly. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but he spoke again. "Grandma, I found the notebook, all those names. How can you carry that alone? Why not share it with me?" She swallowed, leaning on the banister. "Those children, they're my second family," she whispered. "After losing Emily, I promised no child would feel abandoned, but it's my burden, not yours." "Don't you see?" he said, frustration flaring. "I want to help, but you keep locking me out. I'm sorry for what I said before." "I never meant to hurt you." She studied his face, eyes glistening. "I know," she whispered, reaching up to gently stroke his cheek. "But some pains dig too deep. Remember, I lost my own daughter, your mother, far too soon. I never forgave myself for that. And then Emily. I couldn't save her either." A hush blanketed the hallway. He wanted to ask more, to pry into the heartbreak she carried from losing her daughter and Emily, but she turned away, wiping her tears. "Let's not do this now," she said wearily. "I'm tired, Caleb, I need to rest." Left alone, he lingered by her door, gazing at the chipped paint and scuffed floor. How many nights had she spent awake, crocheting for kids she'd never met, trying to keep a promise she made to a dying child decades ago? And who was the unnamed child in that final entry? The one I'll never see. That evening, while Evelyn dozed on the sofa, he studied her face. Age had etched faint lines around her mouth, betraying years of silent grief. Her breathing was shallow, reminding him that time was marching on. The revelation of her relentless devotion weighed heavily on him. She was, in essence, fighting battles for every child who faced the darkness alone. Perhaps in her mind, she was also fighting for him. With trembling resolve, he promised himself he would do whatever it took to fulfill the promise she had kept all these years. And maybe, in helping her, he could finally mend the invisible tear in their bond. The next morning brought an eerie stillness. Caleb woke to find Evelyn's door ajar. A faint rustling sound reached his ears, followed by a muted thud. Alarmed, he rushed inside her room. She lay on the floor beside her bed, eyes wide and breath ragged. "Grandma!" he exclaimed, dropping to his knees. She tried to wave him off, but her hand shook uncontrollably. Panic gripped him. He grabbed his phone and dialed emergency services. Minutes later, paramedics lifted her gently onto a stretcher, whisking her away to the very hospital he had visited in search of answers. In the chaos, he noticed she clutched a small bundle of yarn and a crochet hook so tightly they had to pry it from her fingers. She wouldn't release them until her eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion overwhelming her. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, Caleb held the yarn in his hands, feeling strangely protective of the frayed spool and the half-finished row of stitches. At the hospital, he paced the waiting area, replaying everything that had happened. A nurse eventually guided him to an examination room, where a weary doctor explained that Evelyn had suffered a mild stroke. "We'll keep her here for observation. She's stable but very weak. Her recovery will take time." Caleb felt like the ground had fallen away beneath him. She was all he had, and though their relationship had been fraught with tension lately, the thought of losing her terrified him. He phoned Liam, who arrived with an uncharacteristically solemn face. They sat on stiff chairs in the corridor, waiting for any update. When at last a nurse allowed him a brief visit, he found Evelyn half awake in a small room. Machines beeped softly around her. She opened her eyes and tried to speak, but her words were slurred. He leaned in to catch her faint whisper, "The blanket. Finish. For me." She was referring to the crocheted piece they had taken from her. He gripped her hand. "Grandma, I will. Just focus on getting better," he whispered, tears burning his eyes. Outside, he found himself confronted by the same corridor leading to Emily's room. Though trembling, he walked there once more, clasping the unfinished blanket. The walls seemed darker than before, each crocheted patch cast in shadows. In the corner, he noticed a new detail he hadn't seen, a portrait of a smiling young nurse pinned next to a crocheted flower. Maybe it was another volunteer. He realized how, even in the gloom, there were so many layers of hope woven into these walls. He sank onto a faded armchair, the half-finished blanket on his lap. He studied the uneven stitches, noticing how Evelyn's last row was more shaky than her usual perfect loops. Her illness must have been creeping up on her, making her hands unsteady. Carefully, he tried to replicate her pattern, but the yarn slipped. He was clumsy, lacking her deft skill. He cursed under his breath, frustration mounting. A soft voice startled him. "Need help?" It was Nurse Pemberton, the woman who'd shown him Emily's file. She offered a kind smile. "I dabble in crochet. I used to help your grandmother finish some of the bigger projects." Wordlessly, he handed her the yarn. She demonstrated the stitch, guiding his hands. Together, they managed a few messy loops before Caleb's eyes welled with tears. He blinked them back. "This means so much to her," he said, his voice husky. "She never really told me why, but I know it's about a promise she made, and about losing people she loved." Pemberton nodded gently. "Your grandmother's a special soul. She's carried the weight of regret for decades, as if every stitch were a plea for forgiveness." They continued crocheting, the hush of the hospital hallway wrapping them in an odd comfort. By the time evening fell, the blanket remained unfinished, but at least now Caleb knew how to move forward. Nurse Pemberton promised she'd help again if he needed it. He thanked her and returned to Evelyn's bedside. Her eyes fluttered open when he walked in, and a shadow of relief crossed her face. Despite her condition, she motioned weakly for the blanket. He showed her the progress. "Not perfect," he admitted, "but I'm trying." Her lips twitched in a faint smile, then she mouthed, "Proud of you." He gently squeezed her hand, fighting tears. "Grandma, I'm sorry for everything, for telling you I didn't need you." Her gaze warmed with understanding, though she struggled to form words. After a moment, she whispered, "Love you. Always." A pang of both regret and gratitude tore through him. Standing there, watching her fight for every breath, he realized the hospital was just another backdrop in her lifetime of giving. She had poured her heart into those crocheted squares so that no child would feel the chill of abandonment. And now, to honor her promise and perhaps find his own redemption, he needed to finish the blanket. Early morning light filtered through the window of Evelyn's hospital room, illuminating the pastel walls and the stack of crocheted squares by Caleb's feet. He had camped there overnight, dozing in a stiff armchair. The doctor said her condition was stable, but every time she shifted in bed, his heart lurched. After breakfast, Nurse Pemberton appeared with a small basket of yarn. "Figured you might need this," she said gently. "Also, there's someone you should meet. She's been working here for years, and she remembers your grandmother from way back." She led him down a hallway to a break room where an older nurse, Harriet, greeted him warmly. Her tired eyes brightened at the mention of Evelyn M. "So you're the grandson. I remember your grandma from the 70s. She'd pop in unannounced, arms loaded with blankets. She even volunteered to hold babies when our ward was understaffed." Harriet rummaged through a folder, producing a faded photograph. It showed a younger Evelyn cradling a little girl with big, frightened eyes. Emily, presumably. Harriet tapped the photo. "I was a new nurse then. That child had no visitors, so your grandmother practically adopted her. I think it reminded Evelyn of a sorrow she carried, but she never really said much beyond, 'I won't let her die alone.'" Caleb swallowed hard. "She had a daughter, my mother, who passed away, then Emily. She must have felt so helpless." Harriet nodded. "Yes, dear. Losing a child can drive someone to extremes. In Evelyn's case, she poured her grief into caring for children like Emily." Caleb thanked her and made his way back to the hospital lounge, where he spread out his grandmother's half-finished blanket. He fingered the gold yarn that spelled out "Never Alone" across one corner. It dawned on him that maybe this piece was destined for a specific child, a vow left unfulfilled. He had to complete it. Over the following days, he juggled school with hospital visits. Each night he stayed by Evelyn's side, crocheting with Nurse Pemberton's guidance. Though he often stabbed his finger on the hook, he eventually figured out the pattern. Each row became more confident, each stitch a personal promise. Strangely, crocheting felt almost therapeutic, as if each loop purged a fraction of the guilt lodged in his chest. One afternoon, while hooking loops in the corridor, he spotted a little girl around 6 years old, peeking from behind a wheelchair. A nurse explained, "That's Amelia. She's got leukemia. She's shy." Something about her wide, timid eyes reminded Caleb of the photographs he'd seen of Emily. Driven by an impulse, he smiled and offered a small crocheted flower he'd made while practicing. Amelia approached cautiously, curiosity lighting her gaze. "Is that for me?" she asked in a whisper. "If you want it," Caleb replied, shrugging. "I'm still learning, so it's not very good." She clutched the flower to her chest. "It's pretty." They fell into conversation, albeit brief and hesitant. Every time he returned to the corridor, she sought him out, eyes bright with childlike hope. He showed her how to hold the yarn, and she giggled at his clumsy demonstrations. It was a fragile connection, but it buoyed his spirits. When Evelyn was strong enough to speak a little more, she asked for him to bring the blanket over. Her hands shook as she traced the stitches he'd made. Though her eyes brimmed with tears, she smiled. "Good job," she managed to say, voice raspy. He saw the depth of emotion in her face, as though a chapter of her life was finally coming full circle. That evening, a doctor pulled Caleb aside. "We might discharge your grandmother soon if her vitals keep improving, but she'll need rehabilitation. Are you able to care for her at home?" The question sent his mind into a whirl. He wasn't sure how they would manage. Finances were tight, and he was just a student with no job. But looking at Evelyn through the glass window, he knew he had no choice. "Yes," he nodded. "I'll figure it out." The following day, he found Amelia crying in the hallway, frightened after a painful medical test. He knelt down, crocheted doll in hand, something he'd tried to replicate from the picture he found in the attic. Her tears ebbed as she accepted it, hugging it close. "It's for you," he said softly, "to remind you that you're never alone." She sniffled, tucking her chin against the doll's yarn hair. "Do you promise you'll come back?" He forced a gentle smile. "I do." Later, As he worked on the last few stitches of his grandmother's blanket, a wave of clarity washed over him. This was more than a physical item. It was the embodiment of Evelyn's vow, first made to a child named Emily, who never had a family. Somehow, Caleb was carrying that vow forward. Each thread connected him to a legacy of compassion and a chance to heal a part of himself he hadn't even realized was broken. 15 years swept by in what felt like the blink of an eye. Bristol changed, new buildings rose, old shops closed, and the hospital expanded into a modern facility. Caleb, now in his early 30s, had strands of grey creeping into his hair. Evelyn's stroke had left her partially frail, but she remained unwavering in spirit. Though she moved more slowly, she still crocheted from time to time, guiding him with a gentle voice whenever he asked for help with patterns. Emilia grew up under the hospital's care. Her cancer treatments were a trial by fire, but she emerged stronger, fueled by a fierce resolve. Caleb visited her often, crocheting bright hats and shawls to lift her spirits during chemotherapy. In time, her health improved. Inspired by her own experiences, she decided to become a pediatric oncologist. To everyone's delight, she earned a scholarship to study medicine. Evelyn's conditions stabilized over the years, though her hands never regained their old agility. She spent quiet afternoons in a rocking chair, occasionally advising Caleb on a stitch or pattern. Sometimes she recalled bits of her past, speaking softly of how she once met a girl named Emily who was alone in a hospital. Those recollections ended with tears in her eyes, but also a certain peace at having passed her mission on to her grandson. Emilia returned to Bristol as a full-fledged doctor. She contacted Caleb, inviting him and Evelyn to the grand opening of a new pediatric wing at the refurbished hospital. On a crisp autumn day, they stood in front of a gleaming glass facade. The air buzzed with excitement as donors, medical staff, and local politicians gathered under a bright banner. A microphone crackled, and Emilia stepped forward to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice steady but warm. "This new wing is more than just extra rooms and modern equipment. It's a place of healing and compassion. When I was 6, I was that frightened child, uncertain of my future. A kind soul named Caleb crocheted me dolls and blankets, carrying on a promise made by his grandmother. Their gift of warmth became my hope." Caleb's heart pounded as everyone turned to look at him. His cheeks flushed, but he managed a small smile. Evelyn, seated beside him, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. She was too frail to stand, but he could feel her pride radiating. Emilia continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd like to name this wing in honor of 2 extraordinary individuals. One who passed too soon but inspired endless compassion, and the other who carried a vow beyond her own heartbreak. May I present the Evelyn and Emily Pediatric Wing, where the thread never breaks." A hush fell over the crowd as a commemorative plaque was unveiled. It bore an image of a crocheted heart, a single golden thread weaving through it. Tears blurred Caleb's vision, and he glanced at his grandmother. She mouthed silent words of gratitude. For a moment, the memory of that old dusty room called Emily's room flooded his thoughts. The crocheted blankets, the photos of children, the plaque with Evelyn's name. Now it all culminated here, in a shimmering new facility that embodied the same promise. No child should ever feel alone in the cold darkness of life's hardships. The ceremony ended, and guests filed inside to tour the new wing. Caleb wheeled Evelyn through bright hallways lined with cheerful murals. Small children peeked out of rooms, some hooked to IVs, others laughing with visiting family. In one corridor, a staff member passed out crocheted blankets, pieces Caleb had helped make, each bearing a small tag that read, "Never Alone." Turning a corner, they encountered a new mural, a silhouette of 2 figures embracing beneath a quilt of stars. Beneath it, the words, Sometimes one thread of love can mend 1,000 broken hearts. Evelyn reached out, fingertips trembling against the wall. She whispered, "Emily," as if the child's spirit were there, watching over them all. A small hand tugged at Caleb's jacket. He looked down to see a curly-haired girl holding a crocheted teddy bear. "Did your grandma make this?" she asked, eyes shining with curiosity. He knelt, looking at the bear's neat stitches. "She taught me how," he replied softly. "But yes, in a way, it's part of her." The girl beamed. "It's my best friend now." Evelyn smiled, tears shining, and Caleb felt a deep warmth bloom in his chest. Gone were the resentments he'd once held. Gone was the shame he felt about crocheted clothes. In their place was a profound respect for the quiet devotion that had shaped his life, and now shaped the lives of countless children in need. Later, they stopped by a waiting room that overlooked a courtyard garden. Rays of sunlight fell upon a fountain, the water glimmering in the breeze. He recalled standing in a cramped kitchen years ago, hearing the scrape of a crochet hook in the darkness. In that moment, he understood fully. Each stitch his grandmother made was a step away from her own sorrow and a step toward giving someone else a spark of hope. As the sun began its slow descent, Evelyn dozed in her wheelchair, the bustle of the hospital fading to a gentle hum around them. Caleb quietly took out a small ball of yarn and the old crochet hook she had given him. With careful hands, he began another row on a tiny blanket. It was far from perfect, but perfection wasn't the point. Each loop, each knot, carried a promise passed down from Emily to Evelyn, from Evelyn to him, and now from him to generations of children who deserve to feel the warmth of love. And in that soft, golden twilight, he knew that no matter what else happened in life, the thread would never break. Not as long as there were hearts willing to pick up the needle and continue the work of compassion, one stitch at a time. Sometimes, the greatest legacies are not measured in wealth or fame, but in quiet acts of love repeated in silence. Evelyn's life teaches us that a single promise, carried through the years, can warm not just one heart, but generations. Her stitches were not just thread and yarn, but memory, sacrifice, and the deepest form of love. Caleb's journey shows us that healing often begins when we finally open our eyes to the sacrifices made in our name. What promises are you still holding in your heart, and who might be waiting to feel their warmth? What did this story make you feel? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and leave a like to support more heartfelt stories like this. Comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to know your country or city. And don't leave just yet. Click the video on your screen right now to watch another unforgettable story that will move your soul even deeper. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.